Again, welcome so much. I am thrilled tonight to be presenting a lovely gentleman, Dr. Richard Kahn. He will be talking about his new book, Diseases in the District of Maine, 1772 to 1820, the unpublished work of Jeremiah Barker, a rural physician in New England. Now, for several of you who may have joined us at a previous program recently with Nancy Harmon Jenkins, we were talking about Martha Ballard, who was also very well known as a midwife in central Maine during this very same time period. So I'm thrilled if you joined us for that you've come back for this one, and we'll hear a little bit more about other physicians in Maine during this very same period. But before we begin that, let me just tell you a little bit about our presenter tonight. So Dr. Richard Kahn is retired after having practiced internal medicine in the Mid-Coast area for 50 years. He looks too young for having practiced for 50 years, so I don't believe that. He has had an almost pathological interest in medical history since attending medical school at Tufts University School of Medicine. He has been active in several organizations devoted to medical history, most notably the American Association for Medical History, for the History of Medicine, and the American Ostler Society. I also wanted to note that Dr. Kahn will be donating proceeds from the sale of his book to the Maine Historical Society. And if you're interested in purchasing the book directly through them, you can find a link to that right on the Camden Public Library's website. If you go to our calendar for December 3rd, you'll see the program listing for today, and there's a link at the bottom of the page that'll take you right there. All right, so enough of my chattering. Without further ado, I'd like to turn this program over to Dr. Kahn. Dr. Kahn, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, and I want to thank Nikki Moanis and you for having me. And I'd like to thank whoever's attending that they're interested. And it'd be nice. I hope you enjoy what I have to say. Shall I put the screen share on?
Yes, perfect. Go down to the bottom of the screen and click that green button. All right, I see it.
Okay. This is something I had made up because a number of people want signed copies. Well, in these days, it's difficult, signed copies. So I had this made up. Disease in the District of Maine. It was written 200 years ago by Jeremiah Barker, and a publication delay, 200 years, allowed me to put it in some perspective. Whoops. This is a very historic year, 2020. 400 years ago, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. 200 years ago, Maine became a state. And 100 years ago, American women got the vote. What I'm going to talk about today has to do with medicine 200 years ago, and I'll try to relate it to what's going on in medicine today, with obviously COVID-19. This all began about 30 years ago, 1990. I was at the Maine Historical Society in Portland, working on some project, and I asked Glenn Skillens, who was then curator, anything of medical interest that I should know about. And he said, see collection 13, the Jeremiah Barker collection, and that's what got me started. This is his bibliography of Maine imprints from 1785 to 1820. But I just thought I'd take a second. How do you write a book? I've never written a book before. I didn't have the faintest idea. But I read books on how to write a proposal to have a book accepted, and how to write a book. Anyway, I did a 19-page proposal, and I sent it in to several university presses, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and Oxford University Press. And to my amazement, the editor of Oxford University Press liked the idea. He made some suggestions to make the proposal stronger. I did that and then sent it back and waited, expecting it to be rejected. What he did was send it out to 7 anonymous reviewers in Canada, United States, and Britain. And they sent questions back, and basically they all liked the idea if I could do what I said I'd do. And so then it went back to Oxford University Press, and I got an email saying that on Monday he's going to present it to the board. So Monday comes about, nothing. Tuesday, nothing. And I said to myself, I'm certain he's trying to write a nice rejection letter. and not hurt my feelings. Well, Wednesday, I got an email, and thank goodness the subject line said, congratulations. What I didn't know is the Oxford University Press in New York has to send it to Oxford University Press in Oxford to have their board accept it. And then it's then I had to write the whole thing. I had worked on the transcription and the people and everything, but I had to write the 5 chapters I'm going to tell you about, and the glossary and everything else. And last year there was no, I guess it was earlier this year, on Maine. This is the bicentennial. There was a program on Maine history at University of Maine, and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who Julia mentioned, was there, and I've known her for years. And one of the graduate students said, she writes beautifully. She said, "What's your hint? What to write a good history?" She said, "I have 3 suggestions: revise, revise, revise." And that's what I've been doing for the past year, basically full time. This is the book that came out. This is the dust jacket that actually my wife Patty designed. Sent it in. The Oxford University Press art department tweaked it a little bit, but basically this is her design. It's a page of the manuscript as a background. Books have changed a lot in the past 2,000 years, haven't they? This cartoon on top, it's called a book. I'm not sure where the batteries go. And this one, just to open it, you don't need a password. Well, Stephen Greenblatt wrote The Swerve 9 years ago, a wonderful book about a poem, 2,000-year-old poem that was lost. The church wasn't overly enthusiastic about it. It had to do with religion, and it had to do with science. Anyway, in the 15th century, an out-of-work scribe that worked for the Pope that was deposed found it in the back of a German library and transcribed it. That's what's come down to it. My only reason for bringing it up here is in this book, he wrote that we scrolled for information. And think of the Torah, the library in Alexandria, rolls of information. And then in the 4th or 5th century, the Codex was developed, C-O-D-E-X. And that's a paged book, the way we recognize books today. So for the next 1,500 years, we were turning pages. But at the end of the 20th century, we started scrolling, didn't we? And I'm sure a lot of you, and I certainly do, a lot of scrolling. And I just thought that scrolling for information, turning pages, and now we're scrolling a lot. Medical history provides us with a critical perspective on the contingency of medical knowledge production and circulation, about knowledge that was changing, what influences it. And it helps as clinicians, as physicians or nurses, to tolerate ambiguity. We can't always be certain. We do the best we can with incomplete knowledge. But patients the same way. We're inundated with information, and it's changing. My hero, Sir William Osler, about 120 years ago, wrote, "The philosophy of one age becomes the absurdities of the next, and the foolishness of yesterday becomes the wisdom of tomorrow." How many things have we seen change 180 degrees? In 1896, Osler wrote, "Humanity has but 3 great enemies: fever, famine, and war. And of these, by far the greatest, by far the most terrible is fever." Now what we're with this COVID-19, we're almost up to the total deaths in World War II. So we're seeing this again. We've been spoiled. We haven't seen anything like this since before I was born, in the 1918 flu epidemic. But when Osler wrote that, 1900-ish, the 10 leading causes of death in the United States were, the first 3 were infectious: pneumonia, tuberculosis, and diarrheal diseases. Life expectancy was about 47, but if you made it to 16, you had a fair chance of getting up to the 60s. So many children died. In the end of the century, 1997, heart disease, cancer, and stroke, and infectious disease are way down there. Well, we're back to infectious disease, at least these months, and I hope we won't have it too much longer. What's in Jeremiah Barker's book, is History of Disease in the District of Maine. It's a primary source. It's what he wrote about diseases, epidemics, and treatments in New England 200 years ago. I'm going to give you a bit of epistemology, that is the theory and grounds of knowledge and its limits and validity, and a framework for thinking about disease, how it changed over time, and some general comments on medical geography and the contingency of knowledge and uncertainty in medicine, and I'll end with that. And now the book. This is the story of a lost manuscript, an unpublished book written 200 years ago by a rural physician in New England. It was released by Oxford University Press in August of this year, and I hope it will be an important new primary source for medical history research and teaching. The Jeremiah Barker papers include 2 manuscript boxes, letters, casebooks, several texts with marginalia by Barker, plus his unpublished manuscript. It's a 50-year record of his reflections on disease, diagnoses, treatments, and outcomes, with an unusual effort to consult and cite the medical literature and other physicians in a changing medical landscape as practice and authority shifted from historical to scientific. In short, it's a remarkable record of medicine as practiced in northern New England 200 years ago. This is a subscription paper for the book, meaning a person would sign up for this and how many books he or she wanted in advance, and they'd know how many to print. This was not necessary for something like the Bible. Everybody would buy the Bible, but a book like this, a number of them were printed by subscription. It tells us that the book would include biographical sketches of physicians, would inquire into the causes, natures, and prevalency of consumption. Consumption after the mid-19th century is what we call tuberculosis. Well, Barker maintained it was curable, and that he wrote this book to be intelligible to those who are destitute of medical science. So he was writing for physicians, but he was also writing for a general public, an educated general public. He said the book would be sold for $2 in boards. And boards means it's sewn together, a cardboard, and then you take it to your binder, whether you want leather binding. That's what it means in boards. So the $2, that sounds pretty inexpensive. That would be about $43 today in purchasing power. And I checked several book catalogs from Boston and New York in this during that period, and that's about what other medical books cost. Although the printed subscription paper says cases begin in 1772, Barker actually recorded epidemics and diseases going back to 1735 using the diary of Reverend Thomas Smith, who you see at the left of your screen. He became the minister of the First Parish Church in Portland in, I think it was 1727. But like many ministers at the time, Smith attended to the medical as well as the spiritual needs of his parishioners. So that helped Barker go back to 1735, and there's epidemics in his manuscript talking about that. The publication of Barker's manuscript, fully annotated, includes my 5-chapter introduction. Chapter 1 is a sketch of Barker's background, education, and writing. Chapter 2, the difficulty he had obtaining medical literature through books, journals, newspapers, and the post. So picture, we're going back 200 years. Books weren't allowed through the mail, by the way. Transportation was difficult. There was the Revolutionary War, which gave them some problem obtaining literature, and then the War of 1812. So he had difficulty, and I talk about that. Chapter 3 is about the changing medical climate as I say, as science supplanted the words of Hippocrates and Galen, 400 BC or 140 AD. And towards the mid and late 18th century, if you were having a discussion, arguing with somebody, and they could find Galen from 140 AD and find something, and the end of the discussion would be, "Thus saith Galen," end of discussion. Well, that was just changing around the end of the 18th century when Barker was writing this. Chapter 4 examines Barker as a dangerous innovator, experimenting with the new chemistry of Lavoisier. And here's, on your right, is his first major article talking about alkaline therapy and for various diseases. And on the left is Marie Anne and Antoine Lavoisier. He's considered the father of modern chemistry, and I suppose she's the mother. Patty has helped me with this project for all these many years. Well, Marie Anne helped her husband. She translated Priestley. They did experiments together. And I think the illustrations of the chemical apparatus were done by her. Unfortunately, Lavoisier was guillotined in 1794. By the way, the guillotine comes from Dr. Guillotine, who was opposed to capital punishment, but it took his name. It was a German instrument. Finally, chapter 5 suggests ways for the general reader to approach a 200-year-old manuscript, avoiding presentism, post hoc fallacy, and confirmation bias. I'll tell you what they are. I ask readers to evaluate Jeremiah Barker's medical knowledge, therapy, and reasoning, avoiding presentism, that is, the tendency to use present-day ideas and perspectives to judge a 200-year-old medical document. Can't do that. As Jackie Duffin, a wonderful historian from Canada, wrote, it's unfair and anachronistic to blame predecessors for not saying, seeing, and knowing what could not yet be said, seen, or known. I ask readers to consider the post hoc fallacy. That is the assumption that one event is thought to cause a later event just because it happened early. May be true, may not. They may not be causally related. I'll tell you, it's a problem in medicine today also. Though numerical methods were introduced in the 18th century with procedures such as smallpox inoculation by Zabdiel Boylston in Boston. It was published in 1726. They did it, I think, 1721. But there were some population studies, John Graunt in England, bills of mortality, looking at mortality, but there was very little on medical therapy. And then there's confirmation bias. And this is, we're all subject to this. We remember things that conform to our previously held ideas. Well, that's nothing new. Francis Bacon, 400 years ago, wrote, human understanding, when it is once adopted, draws all things else to support and agree with it. And though there may be greater number and weight on the other side, yet it either neglects and despises, or else by some distinction sets aside and rejects. Here you see a map of northern New England, of the northern New England coastline, with Cape Cod at the bottom and the curving coast at Maine at the top. Until 1820, as you know, Maine was part of Massachusetts. This map was from 1755, and it hadn't even become the District of Maine yet. This map says eastern part of Massachusetts. Barker was born in 1752 in Scituate, Massachusetts, in this house, where he had a classical education under Reverend Mr. Cutter, the congregational minister. His medical training consisted of a preceptorship under Bella Lincoln of Hingham, Massachusetts. And that's his medical school, that's Lincoln's home. Preceptorship or apprenticeship was at that time the most common form of training for American physicians who had any training at all. You could be a physician, just say, I'm a physician. But that was it for most people who had any medical training. And we have to bear in mind that there were only 2 medical schools in the colonies at this time. So in 1769, there were 2 schools, College of Philadelphia, which became University of Pennsylvania, and in New York, King's College, which after the Revolution changed its name to Columbia. Harvard had no medical school until 1782. Fortunately for Barker, his preceptor was a 1754 graduate of Harvard College who, after preceptorship, studied in London hospitals and received an MD, King's College, Aberdeen in 1765. So here you see a map of the Massachusetts coastline from Boston to Cape Cod. Barker would move to Maine after serving on the ill-fated Bagaduce or Penobscot expedition of 1779. July and August. As you may know, we sent something like 40 ships. The British were building a fort in Castine, high on a bluff. So we sent these 40 ships. Paul Revere was in charge of artillery, Lovell land forces, Dudley Saltonstall Navy, but they dilly-dallied for a couple months. The Navy said, we're not going to go near until the Army gets rid of the cannons that are up there. And the Army says, we're not going to go up there until the Navy gets rid of the cannons. Anyway, it was disaster. They ended up, several British men of war came around. They chased these ships, most of them were smaller ships, up the Penobscot River, and we burned the entire fleet. Barker was on one of those ships, and he wrote that he saved some medicines from the burning ship, and it helped him get started in Maine, as medicines were difficult to obtain. In 1780, Barker moved to Maine, and he wrote, finding the air on Cape Cod injurious to my constitution, and physicians being numerous, I removed to Gorham. He didn't say anything about the traffic on Cape Cod. Barker had married into the prominent Gorham family, which had originally settled that town. In 1789, Barker and his wife moved to Stroudwater, which is now part of Portland, or Falmouth then. And he built this house in 1799. That's on the right is a photograph, about 100 years old, and on the left is the way it looked last fall. It's down the Westbrook Street from the Tate Mansion, if anybody is interested in looking at it. He died at age 83 in 1835. This map shows the location of Barker's new home in the District of Maine, both in Gorham, Barker's new home in the District of Maine, both in Gorham and Stroudwater. He practiced everything, the area of this map and further northeast along the coast. One of the ways Barker kept up with current medicine was correspondence with other physicians, including some elites of his age. This is I'm going to read an excerpt from a letter that he wrote, that Barker wrote to Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia. Rush is a graduate of College of New Jersey, which later became Princeton. He trained in Edinburgh. He was professor of medicine in Philadelphia, author of several medical texts, and signer of Declaration of Independence. Thus, said Barker to Rush, I had opportunities of observing the habits, customs, and manner of living among the first settlers. In many towns, I noted these things, always carrying pen, ink, and paper. The first white inhabitants of Maine lived for a time in a very similar manner as the Indians did. Their exercise was great, their food simple and wholesome, consisting chiefly of Indian corn, salted pork, sometimes bear. Rum could be procured only in small quantities, and happy it would have been for them and their posterity had this continued to be the case. Wine and beer is different. People made it home. It's distilled liquor that's the problem. So then he wrote, rum today, so this letter was written in 1806. Rum today is conveyed into the country towns, as it were, through aqueducts, but none is lost for want of throats. Don't you love that? Barker's manuscript covers many medical topics in over 100 case studies, and they're very readable. Volume 1 is chapter on mental illness, dangers of spirituous liquors, various epidemics and diseases, pneumonia, childbed fever, apoplexy or strokes, and anasarca, filling up with fluid. Volume 2 is all about consumption, again, what we would call tuberculosis. It's history, prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. Here are a couple examples of the pages we work with. On the right is a page of the manuscript, all of which have been faithfully transcribed as written, including crossed out words, with original punctuation, grammar, and spelling. Barker's many references have been located and cited, and the people identified whenever possible. And again, I wrote a glossary, about 300 words, to make it accessible to 21st century readers. On the left is a page from his casebooks, and his casebooks were reflected in his manuscript book. If he's writing about a case, it was pretty much the same. He didn't gloss it and made it look better than it was or whatever. Barker was determined to add to the medical literature as well as keeping up with it. The first US medical journal, the Medical Repository, was in New York, was launched in July of 1797. And in it, Barker announced his intention to publish his book. In the course of his practice, he published at least 12 articles in the Medical Repository reporting on unusual events, epidemics, and on alkaline therapy that he used for various diseases. This is how it went out to the subscribers, and then they would bind it. And if you're going to any medical history museum, you'll find it bound by year. But this is, I have a copy this is how they went out to the public. And here's a list of the articles that Barker wrote. I don't intend for you to read them, but basically they have to do with febrile diseases, in Cumberland County in the Portland area. These are some more of his articles, and one article in the Philadelphia Medical Museum. That's the second medical journal in the United States. One unusual outbreak facing Barker and his community was an epidemic of severe infections in 1784. He wrote of Captain Graffam of Wyndham, age 60, of good habit, who broke the skin of his leg over the tibia. There were other people having at the same time, trivial wounds becoming deteriorating and causing death. The wound readily inflamed and put on a gangrenous hue. It turned black with red streaks extending up the thigh. He died in 14 days. At the same time, there was a terrible epidemic of childbed fever. They had never seen it before. And he seemed to make a connection between these two virulent outbreaks. He wrote, that same spring of 1784, several women were attacked with fever in their puerperal state during their pregnancy, during their delivery, even after normal travails, normal pregnancy. And in most, the disease proved fatal, at least in my own practice, but also the practice of other people in Portland, Gorham, et cetera, and other places. They hadn't seen it before. And it was terrible. And Barker wrote many pages on the epidemic, what he did, what he read, to whom he wrote to discuss this epidemic. He also published a lengthy public discussion with Dr. Nathaniel Coffin of Portland. So this is the Falmouth Gazette, and this begins in February. This is the second month of the first newspaper published in Maine. Now, Nathaniel Coffin was a physician, well-trained. His father before him was a physician. So they've been in Maine for many years. Barker had only been here for 5 years. But it's very interesting to read the discussion. And one of the things Barker complained about, that Coffin wasn't keeping up with the modern literature. Barker tried like hell to keep up with the literature, to do the best he could. What's the best? What's thought to be the best, as we all try to do. A couple of case studies illustrate how Barker used the literature for guidance. His patient narratives include this case of consumption. April 1790, a lady in Portland, age 40, had been troubled for some years with slight catarrhal cough. As she walked to church with kid shoes in a thin dress when the ground was wet. So I hope none of you women do this. The next morning, her cough was worse. She expectorated bloody mucus 3 mornings in succession, 2 ounces each time. A moderate hectic, that is a fever, with its usual train ensued, and she died in the July following after a 3-month course. Soon after, a lady in the bloom of life rode 10 miles in a chaise, covered. She was wearing a muslin gown, damp evening air. Next morning, she woke with hoarseness, pulmonary consumption ensued, and she died within a few months. A physician ironically called this muslin consumption. A muslin being a light cotton, it was very, very flammable, by the way. So he's talking about the risk of getting consumption with women wearing these gowns, but there was also another problem. It was very flammable, as I said, and that caricature from around 1800, it's, I think it's a Gilray, yes. And the title is Advantages of Wearing Muslin, and that's a woman whose dress is catching fire. So just think of all these frilly gowns and candles, lanterns in a room and a fireplace. you can see how this would happen. And as a matter of fact, on July 11th, 1861, Fanny Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's second wife, his first wife died of childbirth, her dress caught fire and she died in 1861. He was devastated. Suggestions for a diagnosis of consumption. It came from a number of sources, but here's one, Reed's 1806 book. First is wasting or destruction. In fact, that's where the word consumption, the body is being consumed, flesh is being lost, people are weight loss. Insidious approach, it usually comes on gradually, it has ups and downs. Expectoration, coughing, purulent material, a lot of mucus, and then hectic fever. And I just want to mention here, fevers, how were they diagnosed? Although the thermometer had been invented a couple centuries earlier, Galileo and Fahrenheit, and there were thermometers, but they weren't being used clinically, not used clinically until the 1870s. So fever was diagnosed by somebody feeling lousy, weak, sweaty, chills, and a rapid pulse, an increased pulse. So you can see that's some thermometer wasn't being used, but that's how they diagnosed fever. And then hemoptysis, which is the medical term for coughing up blood, might or might not be present. And I just want to emphasize here the predisposing factors. If a mother, father, brother, sister had consumption, the person who's ill is more likely to have it than if no one in the family had it. They didn't know about bacteriology, but they knew this. And it seemed to be more prevalent in women. And according to Barker and others, who compounded the problem wearing those foolish light dresses and inadequate shoes. I don't mean to be a male chauvinist pig, but this is how they were thinking about it, especially in the evening. And here, Barker cites Joseph Young's observation on phthisis. That's another name for consumption or tuberculosis. It was written in 1809. The neck and breasts are bare or covered with a thin gauze. If the breasts are left open to facilitate, this is a medical journal article, by the way. If the breast is left open to facilitate the entrance of Cupid's darts, it affords a more certain mark for the envenomed shaft of the grisly king of terrors. Now you don't see that sort of thing in medical journals today, I'll tell you. Well, Barker was really, he was writing about women's clothing in northern New England, keeping them warm, dry, the snow, the rain. The French were also concerned about women's clothing and consumption. They seemed to be more interested with fashions and the stays, narrowing the chest wall being constricted by some of the fashionable clothes. And tuberculosis consumption is still a problem. 1.5 million people die of tuberculosis each year. Not as many, it's not as big an issue in this country, but it's still a problem in resistant tuberculosis. And from volume 1, chapter 1, this is a case of insanity. In January 1809, Miss L.H. of Scarboro, age 20, brought up in a farmer's house, and she complained of universal heat. She was hot all the time. Everybody was comfortable in the room. She was hot. In July, she became insane, and her friends confined her with cords. They tied her. They didn't know what else to do. Barker was consulted in August, and he bled her 5 times in 4 weeks from the arm, taking a pint each time, and twice from her feet. Before bleeding, she would rave and laugh alternately and made attempts to hurt her attendants with a pair of scissors which she had concealed. What else? They didn't have any other, what else could they do? They could hit her over the head, but you draw blood, that may help quiet things down. So in February, the following February, she had tea at a neighbor's when she complained of heat and pain in the head. On her return, she leaped into a well of water, which extinguished heat and life. Well, that's the well, possibly. Barker cited Pinnell, a leader in the moral treatment of mentally ill, as far as his concern about mental illness. The moral treatment had to do with treating people who are mentally ill kindly, gently. Don't chain them to the wall and throw stones at them, which is the sort of thing that happened. And so that was a change. This was changing. And although Pinnell said bloodletting is useful, can be useful, he said blood is sometimes so lavishly spilled as to render it doubtful whether the patient or the physician has the best claim to the appellation of madman. So Barker tried to steer a course between Pinnell and Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia, who favored more vigorous bleeding. Certainly relieving a violent madman of a significant amount of blood would work to calm him down. And he talks about that in a number of cases. In Boston, George Parkman, who knew Barker, in fact, he asked for Barker's chapter on mental illness, and he wanted to read it, and he sent it back to him with some off-prints that Parkman had written. Parkman was interested in insanity and mental illness. So he wrote about the standard treatment, laxative, purges, and use of mercurials. In Barker's day, mercury salivation. So you'd take mercury, it might give you a sore mouth, and you'd have making a lot of saliva after a couple days. And it was felt to be beneficial for a number of illnesses. Of interest, but I won't go into it in depth, Parkman was murdered in 1849, presumably at the hands of the Harvard professor of chemistry, Harvard College across the river, and Harvard Medical School. He owed Parkman money. I won't go into it, but it's an interesting story, unfortunate story. And this is from Rush's book on diseases of the mind. It was written in 1812, and it's the first book in this country on mental illness. I think I mentioned that. Explaining the usefulness of mercury salivation for abstracting morbid excitement from the brain to the mouth, removing visceral obstructions, changing the cause of, this is my favorite, changing the cause of the patient's complaint by fixing them wholly on their sore mouth that they would get with the mercury. It reminds me of if you have bad headache, smash your finger with a hammer, it gets your mind off your headache. Anyway, by all means, make patients so angry at their physicians and friends that they forget about being insane. The last case that I thought I'd present, this is a cluster of diseases in 1795. So it's about the middle of August, 1795. And Noah Webster, now that's Dictionary Webster. He didn't start working on the dictionary until about 1800. He was a counter. Wherever he'd go, he'd count houses, he'd count, and though not a physician, not a scientist, he tried to make sense. If we're going to have a successful country, we can't have these yellow fever epidemics every summer closing the major cities, major port cities, but the major cities. And he wrote, I've never experienced a state of air so debilitating and unfriendly to animal spirits as the month of August, 1795 in Philadelphia. Some of you may know W.C. Fields. He didn't like Philadelphia very much. First prize is 1 week in Philadelphia. Second prize is 2 weeks in Philadelphia. Anyway, so the bills of mortality showed double the usual number of deaths. So it was a problem. And what Webster did was send a broadside up and down the coast. And he said, I will publish it. And he did in 1796. What was happening? There's no medical journal in the country, but what was happening so people can read it and maybe make some sense and maybe be able to do something about it. The introduction of this to this book says, I'm not going to continue, Webster said, I'm not going to continue work on it. Well, he did continue work on it. And one of the editors of the medical repository read this and he said, we should publish it. And that was, so it was directly due to Webster that the medical repository started. And in 1799, Webster published his 2-volume Epidemic and Pestilential Disease, wonderful book talking about their thoughts in this country and abroad. So back to the case. William Knight, a seaman, was attacked with fever in Philadelphia and took passage for Falmouth, Maine, his native place. He arrived on August 23rd. He was lodged in a decayed house containing 9 in the family. I'm not sure whether the home was in town or a little more rural setting. I tried to find out. He died on the 11th of September, attended with black stools and yellow skin. So he was jaundiced and had intestinal bleeding, typical of yellow fever, although there are other things that can cause the same thing. But yellow fever was booming in Philadelphia. 2 weeks After his death, a sister, age 13, was seized with vomiting and head pain. This is in this house, delirium. She survived after a tough time, but she recovered, but during her illness, a brother, age 7, was attacked with fever. He hemorrhaged from the nose, black stools, and he died on the 14th day. A sister, age 18, was seized with fever. She died on the 8th day after a profuse hemorrhage from her bowels. And a mother, age 49, was seized and died on the 9th day, attended with black stools. They were attended by a French physician. I have to watch out for those French physicians, who gave some gentle evacuants and prescribed wine with elixir vitriol to stop putrefaction, as he said. These are Barker's words. So in other words, he's not agreeing with this, but this was a standard treatment. If you look for algorithms or how was the proper treatment for a febrile disease, it would include elixir vitriol. What is elixir vitriol? I'm hoping you would ask. It's dilute sulfuric acid, alcohol, and an aromatic such as cinnamon. But that was the standard treatment. They had reasons to think that was better than alkali. Now, Barker is beginning to use alkali, the opposite, after reading the new chemistry of Lavoisier. 3 days before the death of the mother, the daughter, age 25, was seized with fever. She became ill. She had yellow skin, stools were loose, and he said, I made a liberal use of aquacalcis, lime water. So basically he's using antacids and lots of liquids. She soon recovered, as did a younger member of the family who was treated the same way. And I just want to point out here that 200 years ago, they talked about exhibiting or displaying a medicine. If you were sick and I treated you, and over the next week you got better, we would both assume you got better, but the medicine didn't work. If I treated you, however I treated you, and you had 20 bowel movements in the next 4 hours, and a couple of days later you started salivating from the mercury, and you got better, we would both assume that the medicine made a difference. The sick room was then washed with soap suds. 3 of the family escaped fever, none of the visitors, and there was about a 67% mortality. And Barker thought he wasn't so sure that this sort of thing was an inside job, that it didn't have to do with the West Indies. There was a big argument going on. Was this local contagious or anti-contagious? Did it come from abroad? We need to stop the ships, or we need to clean up the piles of debris around the shore. So Barker's use of alkali, again, he's read Lavoisier's chemistry, and he said not being authorized to bleed and use mercury in certain situations on account of supposed putrid tendency. And he found it didn't work very well. My views were directed to use of alkalins. And for their known, this is interesting, from their known tendency to check and even remove putrescency in inanimate substances. Think about an outhouse. It stinks, and stench was an important part. They assumed if you can smell something, there's probably disease that you can get. But what's used in an outhouse? They use lye, strong alkalins. It generally gets rid of the smell. But this case raised the issue of retrospective diagnosis. And it's, in other words, trying to figure out what were they talking about? What disease was that 200 years ago? Very difficult, and you have to be really careful, and you're still not certain. Well, I sent this case history to Randall Packard at Johns Hopkins and Scott Halstead, who's, Scott Halstead is one of the world authorities on yellow fever and dengue. He thought, not all of them, but he thought most of the cases, he thought it was yellow fever, although wasn't aware of yellow fever being in Maine. Well, I did find several cases in Augustin's 1909 book on yellow fever. And what I think we can say is there's no general epidemics. It didn't transmit, but I think ships with yellow fever came in, and maybe people just in that family may have gotten it. And I may have gotten yellow fever, but there were no general epidemics of yellow fever in Maine that I could find. I should mention a bit of medical nationalism found its way into Barker's manuscript, probably due to the War of 1812. This is from the New England Journal of 1813. So that's the second year. The New England Journal began in 1812, and this is the second. This is the second year. America, said one of the learned. This is a quote, learned editors of the London Medical Review, seems to be a country of epidemics as much as is swamps, woods, and savannas. England, we might say in return, seems to be a country of scrofula consumption as much as it is fogs and vapors. We being the New England Journal. Such observations are at least injudicious, not to say incorrect. So you can see a little bit sticky there. And finally, I'm enormously thankful to a number of medical historians who read the manuscript, made suggestions, and particularly to historian John Harley Warner, a professor of history of medicine and history at Yale, who not only reviewed the manuscript, he's probably the authority on medicine in this country during the period that Barker was practicing. He said that Jeremiah Barker's manuscript offers an extraordinary window into the medical world of one non-elite, non-urban physician in the early Republic, and gives us an accessible, engaging, and important source for exploring and reimagining that world. It's interesting, as Julia mentioned, Barker's practicing 60 miles from Martha Ballard, who was practicing in Hollowell. Midwife's Tale, so beautifully, the beautifully written Pulitzer Prize-winning Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary. Well, what Laurel Thatcher Ulrich used bits of the diary, very difficult to read, the diary, not Ulrich, and then she expanded her great knowledge of women's life in that period. The Barker book it's his whole manuscript. You can read what he's saying, and I tried to put it in perspective for all of us. And now for something completely different. I don't know if I can get rid of these things on the side. Oh yeah, much better. The Royal Society in England started in 1660, and nullius in verba is their motto, take nobody's word for it. So it started to, in this period, you should see for yourself. Don't just take what Galen said 140 AD. Look at it yourself and see if you make some sense. Sometimes we may get a little bit carried away. Whoops. We can't be absolutely certain until we run some tests, but your initial blood work indicates that you have a large spear through your right shoulder. Here's some Paraprosdokians on knowledge and history. If you don't learn anything about medical history, you might learn what a Paraprosdokian is if you don't know. It's so cool. It's a figure of speech where the latter part of the sentence or phrase is surprising and unexpected, makes you rethink the first part. Here's one. Light travels fast in sound. This is why some people appear bright until you hear them speak, and that may be appropriate for your speaker this evening. To steal ideas from one person is plagiarism. To steal from many is research. And change is inevitable. It certainly is in medicine. Change is inevitable except from a vending machine. Certainty is not attainable in medicine. That's not a Paraprosdokian. That's what we're stuck with. So how did people think about disease? The Puritans, disease and epidemics, it had to do with the individual and community spiritual status. They weren't reading the Bible enough. They weren't going to services enough. It also gave them some excuse why 90 to 95% of the Native American populations died. And it was God saying that the immigrants, the Puritans, and the people who came to this country from Europe should be here because God is destroying the people that were living here before. By the way, that's an excellent book by David Jones, Rationalizing Epidemics, if anybody's interested in that subject. 17th century England, environment, astrological. For example, influenza, it's the influence of the suns, the constellations, the stars, trying to make sense out of something. We still don't know. Why is 1 year bad? We still don't know. But 18th century, the Enlightenment, rejection of traditional social and religious and political ideas, age of reason, some separation of church and state. 19th century, the Industrial Revolution, steamships, and increased travel-associated diseases. 20th century, assembly line, air travel, and all the things you know about X-rays, antibiotics, genetics. In the 21st century, we're getting rid of some diseases and we may have some new ones, as you see. Predicting history isn't very easy. We're not very good at predicting what will be viewed as historic. And 200 years ago, George Hegel, a German philosopher, wrote, "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk." In other words, the owl, symbol of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, spreads its wings with a little bit of time. Looking back, you'll be able to make better decisions about what was important. Some non-medical technology that changed medical practice. In this, there's a telephone. This is after 1904, the candlestick telephone, but that where patients could call physicians, physicians could call patients. That changed. And here's another non-medical technology that changed medicine, the car. This is the first Maine medical journal, the automobile for the doctor, the Buick, for an 18 horsepower for $800. But that's equivalent to about 22,000 these days. So it's not such a bargain. And on the right is Dr. Fred Campbell, who came to Warren, Maine from Baltimore and started his practice. He rented a horse and buggy, and then I think that's his first car. Medical therapy was changing. This is an example. Dr. Ivan earache, 2000 BC, here, eat this root. 1000 AD, that root is heathen, here, say this prayer. 1850, that prayer is superstition, here, drink this potion. 1940, that potion is snake oil, here, swallow this pill. 1984, that pill is ineffective, here, take this antibiotic. 2020, that antibiotic is unhealthy, here, eat this root. There's something to that, and we're learning that a number of illnesses that had in the past been treated with antibiotics would do just as well without, or even better, without antibiotics. What were the common diseases in the 19th century? So this is shortly after Barker died, but this is the 1850 census, U.S. Census, was the first census where the causes of death. And there you see consumption, tuberculosis, dysentery. Vaccination was important in 1798, and from 1900 to 2000, the number of cases, for example, just pick measles, 500,000 kids had measles around 1900, and by 1998, it was 89 cases. Polio, 16,000 to 0. Anyway, that was a big change. But the deaths from infectious disease, a great deal had to do with public health. It has to do with public health departments, clean water, clean food, clean air, child labor laws, all those things. And if you see, these are deaths from infectious disease. There's the big flu epidemic in 1918, but continued going down. Clean water, particularly for cities. If you lived out in Warren or on a farm and you were the only person, you didn't have much trouble with but living in cities, it was a problem. Sulfa came in 35, penicillin in the 40s, streptomycin in 49, but the diseases, infectious disease were decreasing. And this is the first, this is the history of the District of Maine, published in 1795, the same year that case I presented. And James Sullivan, who wrote it, he became governor of Maine for 1 year. I think he died in office. The people in the District of Maine in a tedious winter long for the soft breezes of Virginia and the Carolinas, but they would be very unwilling to take fever and ague and other disorders incident to those states with the gentle weather in exchange for our northern snowbanks. So remember that in the middle of winter, you wouldn't want to be down there where they had malaria and all those other hot diseases, also hurricanes and flooding, other issues. Anyway, medical geography is important. I can't go into it very much, but when the Pilgrims came to this country, they were heading south. And I don't think they really appreciated what sort of winters they'd be having here. So epidemic, the word comes epi on, demos, on the people. And it's unpredictable. It's predictable that there's going to be epidemics, but it's hard to predict which year and exactly what it's going to be. Just COVID-19 certainly is an example. But diphtheria in the 1730s, in some towns nearly half the children died. That's an epidemic. Well, in the year, consumption, dysentery might kill more people, but that was spread out through the year and life went on. These epidemics, life stops. So a few American epidemics, smallpox and dysentery in 17th century, early 18th century, smallpox and diphtheria, late 18th and early 19th, I mentioned yellow fever in the 1790s and early 1800s, and later, after 1832, Asiatic cholera was a big problem. And the 20th century, various diseases, but this just points out this is the Philadelphia yellow fever epidemic, and showing bodies piled up outside. I mean, life really couldn't go on as usual. So 1780 to 1820, how are diseases thought to spread? Smallpox, venereal disease, person-to-person contact, but yellow fever, cholera, and others wasn't so clear. Was it the ships of trade, or was it the filth and garbage piled up and the undrained water? John Snow and his the Broad Street Pump, this is published in 1854. They found that this is a spot map, what the people that had the cholera almost all used this one well. And when they locked the well, locked the handle, the epidemic went around. And this is how epidemiologists work. What did they have in common? Almost finished. Where are we now? Here's a couple of Maine marine metaphors. This is looking out from our terrace, looking out to sea, and that's an island of knowledge. We have islands of knowledge in a great sea of unknown. And as the islands grow, so does the shores of our ignorance. Everything gets more complicated as we get closer to it. Thomas Wakely, founder of the British journal, The Lancet, which I read every week, we know nothing. We are at sea in a whirlpool of conjecture. So as a non-epidemiologist and non-statistician, oh my God, how did this get in here? Somebody must have hacked my slides. When and how shall COVID-19 end? Well, there could be a socio-political fear ending and a medical ending, and they may be different. A number of people have been writing on this, and I can't go into it in depth, but it's a problem. Politics have always been involved. And, gee, another one. Three things that are necessary to stop an epidemic. Need to have an evidence base. Remember I told you Webster in 1796, he was trying to gather this information so somebody could do something to stop these epidemics. And then the following year, the medical repository. Now there's a place where people can write in, they can be rebutted, or people can agree with them and try to come up with some method of implementation, some method that might help stop these terrible epidemics. Of course, there has to be a political will. The contingency of medical knowledge 200 years ago, uncertainty was a problem then, it's a problem today, and it changes. Webster and Barker complained they didn't have enough information, and we are inundated. We're also getting misinformation. And some of it's just, as we get more information, it adjusts what we thought earlier, but some is based on politics, and there's another agenda, and that makes it even more difficult. Noxious air for Barker, miasms, bad air. Was it the stench? Well, we're talking about aerosols and droplets these days. That sounds like bad air, very similar. And the masks, as they show above. Bloodletting and alkalis that Barker was trying to use. We're having difficulty in 2020. What's the best treatment for COVID-19? The immunizations are working. If you're really interested in this, is a wonderful book that just came out, Calling Bullshit, The Art of Skepticism in a Data-Driven World. These are two professors at University of Washington, but trying to evaluate what you read. It's I thought a wonderful book, and it says, he talks about science, and one of the things he points out, every fact and model can be overturned in the face of new evidence. So when I hear somebody say, oh, they thought it was this back a few months ago, well, it changes as we get more information. We're in the middle of this thing. It will change. It's self-correcting, and science is a cumulative process. It's not just that's the end of it. I'm just about finished. Two mavens, experts on infectious disease, and Anthony Fauci a director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, he was asked, what's different about this COVID-19? He says, I've been doing this 40 years, I've never seen a virus with a spectrum of seriousness so extreme from nothing to death. That surprises. And then Nirav Shah, the head of CDC in Maine, who I think is doing a wonderful job, he said, sadly, there's no vaccine to temper the fear and xenophobia, the fear of strangers, calling it the Chinese virus, et cetera. It doesn't help. And the racism and how there's no vaccine against that. And finally, 202 years ago, cowpox, the vaccination for smallpox, made all the difference in the world. I mean, it was a great discovery, but was it immediately accepted? No, there were anti-vaxxers then, and this is a Gilray caricature showing people who got vaccinated with cows coming out of their armpits and other body parts. So that was a problem. And then when I read this about 5 months ago, Novavax is working on a vaccine that turns moth cells into tiny factories that pump out proteins of the coronavirus that would then be added to something else, and so people can be immunized. When I saw that, I said, oh, there's got to be a caricature. So I asked a friend if he would do a caricature showing what happens when this mothpox vaccine is used. And this is the caricature he did. People gathering around, they don't know why, they had this this vaccine that was made from moth. And they're all gathering around candles and lampposts. They don't know why. And some of them were eating wool. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kahn, for such a cheery holiday program. That was perfect. Okay, we're going to get to some comments and some questions now. So if you have a question for Dr. Kahn, please go ahead and type it into the chat box. The first one that came up is, did Dr. Barker write anything about the dreaded spotted fever, also known as cold fever, that stalked Maine during the War of 1812?
I don't remember specifically him calling it spotted fever, but there's lots of epidemics and lots of diseases. Some I can recognize fairly clearly, but others you just can't. There's a number of diseases. You know what Venn diagrams are? I mean, characteristics, these characteristics, and they have some in common. So there's a number of diseases which have some symptoms and signs in common, and it's hard, that's that retrospective diagnosis business, and we have to be very careful in doing that. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that term was not, I don't recall that term coming up, specific term.
All right, and Nancy asks, or actually she says, also scarlet fever called canker rash in Martha Ballard's diaries.
Right, and he talks a lot about the various sore throats, canker rash. They have numbers of names. There's so the same. I wrote about that, and there's explanation of the various names. So there'll be. It's hard. Before they were culturing strep. How do you tell strep throat from a bad viral throat and from diphtheria? Except for there's something else with pseudomembranes with diphtheria, but it was hard separating, and they weren't mutually exclusive. That's also, so you have a community where some people are getting this, they may have in common sore throats, but they have different diseases, and one might have a much higher mortality than another.
Kate harkens back to some of your comments about yellow fever in Maine, and she said, but yellow fever is transmitted by mosquitoes.
Right. We have mosquitoes, but she's absolutely right. The mosquito that carries yellow fever, but they were brought, as Halstead mentioned and other people writing, they were brought on the ships. Halstead mentioned they were floating mosquito factories. So they would be carrying the mosquitoes so they could come onto land. Now, what I think she's implying, and I think she's correct, is Maine isn't a very nice place for that particular mosquito to live, that particular type of mosquito. So it would have to be just the right conditions, and that's why I wondered about this particular house. It was maybe near the there were a couple of mosquitoes that were on him or with him, just enough. They bred right there, but it never became a community epidemic in Portland. Or so that's, but he's calling it yellow fever. They didn't have a way of separating them.
Right. Susan asks, does Dr. Barker mention or refer to Culpeper's Complete Herbal in his notes? And she's referring to Culpeper from the 17th century.
Herbal. I know Culpeper's herbal. I don't remember him using that. And he was trying. He talks about being a scientific physician, and there's over 100 books cited, and I found them all. Culpeper. He doesn't use I don't recall seeing the Culpeper herbal, but I know it.
So thank you so much. That was the last question. We have a number of different comments saying this was wonderful. Thank you. So informative, so engaging. Lots and lots of thank yous. And I agree completely. That was a magnificent talk and very informative. And for those of you out there who were with us this evening, again, we will be sharing this tomorrow on the Camden Public Library program's YouTube channel. So if you'd like to refer that link to someone, you can go ahead and find us there. If you have any trouble, just email me and I'll send you the link directly. Again, looks like we have one more question just came in. I don't want to ignore it because I think that person was typing. It's a little bit of a long one. Did you find any references to treatments for fevers or other ailments by Indians who had alternate epistemology? Do we know if some of these could provide a remedy for, quote, civilized? And this is a question from Phil.
Okay, I know Phil. Good question from an anthropologist. He talks, what Barker talks about is that the Indians would come to them, the physician, for treatment. And he speaks very nicely about them. He doesn't, it isn't demeaning, but if they were sick, they would come to them. He doesn't talk about the medicines, the willow bark, something that they may have, the Native Americans may have used, but he wasn't demeaning. He didn't put down the Native Americans, which I thought was interesting and nice. I want to thank you, Julia, and I want to thank everybody. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope you learned as much or as well. Of course, the person who does these things learns more than anybody else. So I had fun putting it together, and I hope you enjoyed it.
And the last question is, where can we purchase Richie's book? And we mentioned it at the beginning of the program, but one of the places that you can purchase it is actually, we have a link to it on the Camden Public Library's advertisement for this program. It's on our calendar for December 3rd. That'll take you right there. But the Maine Historical Society's bookstore, is that correct?
That's correct, and all the royalties are going directly to the Maine Historical Society. If you buy it from them, they get, in addition, they get whatever, the profit in addition to the royalty. But you can get it through Amazon if it's difficult to get it from them. Amazon, Oxford University Press. You can go through Oxford University Press. Anyway.
And Dave Lucy just put up a link. So thank you so much. I appreciate that for those of you who are here. And someone asked, what does it cost to get an autograph?
Nothing. Just
Nothing.
Write me or email me. In fact, did I show these things? I showed it at the beginning.
Yes, it was your first slide, yeah.
So if somebody gets one and wants it, if they just send me a note or email me or something, I'll sign one of these and send it to them.
And I've included Dr. Kahn's email address on the Camden Public Library's listing for this program on December 3rd on our calendar, so you can find it all there. All right, once again, thank you so much, everyone. And I hope you'll join us again. Find out about our programs at librarycamden.org. Everyone have a beautiful holiday season and a wonderful evening. Good night. Be well.
Thank you, Julie.